Well, if anybody didn't hear that introduction, I'm Steve Orlins. I'm president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to our fourth Leaders Speak, which is celebrating the 50th anniversary of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. For 50 years at the National Committee, we have been educating Americans about China and Chinese about America. From ping-pong diplomacy to today, we have sought to strengthen the bilateral relationship by fostering exchanges and informed discussion. This year, we have gathered Secretaries of Defense, Secretaries of Commerce, and U.S. trade representatives, as well as national security advisors. Next year, we will gather U.S. Treasury Secretaries, PACOM commanders, and finally, we will hold a similar program like we're doing tonight in China, where I will interview Chinese leaders, many of whom are alumni of our programs. Today, I am truly honored. It's one of the great honors of my life to be joined by two former Secretaries of State. Both are living legends for what they accomplished during their tenures. Dr. Kissinger was National Security Advisor and Secretary of State in the Nixon and Ford administrations, and was instrumental in the reestablishment of relations with China. He has spent 45 years helping leaders on both sides navigate this important bilateral relationship. And we especially appreciate your being here today because on Friday, we all saw you on television with President Xi Jinping, and we know you have to be slightly jet-lagged after that. We also know you recently visited Trump Tower, so we hope to hear more about that. The National Committee has been fortunate to have you serve on our board of directors now for more than 12 years. Today is the 20th anniversary of Secretary Albright's nomination to be Secretary of State under President Clinton. Having served 4 years, as U.S. Ambassador to the UN, she became the first woman to serve as Secretary of State, and at that time, the highest-ranking woman ever in the United States government. A heroine to my three daughters. Secretary Albright played a leading role in the negotiation for China's accession to the WTO and represented the United States at the 1997 transfer of sovereignty over Hong Kong. We've been fortunate to have Secretary Albright serve on the board of directors of the National Committee for 7 years. Before beginning, I'd want to thank our sponsors, the China Center, New York, MasterCard, and Sidley Austin for funding this program. I'd like to especially thank the China Center for providing this incredible venue. For those not with us in person today who are watching on the internet or on television, this morning in New York was overcast and drizzly. We worried that we wouldn't have this spectacular view. But the day turned into a bright, blue, sunny day, and we watched this incredible sunset. And my hope, as corny as it may sound, was U.S. China relations in the future. Maybe cloudy, but it's going to clear up and be bright and sunny in the coming year. Last but certainly not least, I want to thank both Secretary Kissinger and Secretary Albright for joining us today. You have both contributed to world peace in ways too numerous to enumerate. If I started to list all your accomplishments, we wouldn't have time for any questions. So I just thank you for being here. And let me start with the question for Secretary Kissinger.
Can I just interrupt and
Yes,
say
you may.
How happy I am to be here with you and with my good friend, Henry Kissinger. You mentioned that today was the 20th anniversary. Well, Dr. Kissinger was the first person to call me when I was named Secretary of State. And he said, Madeleine, congratulations, you'll do great in the job, but you have taken away my one unique characteristic of being an immigrant Secretary of State. And I said, no, Henry, I don't have an accent.
So we'll even go back further than that, to 1971. And there had been no contact at that point between the United States and China for 22 years. What kind of made you go to China? What did you seek to accomplish? And what lessons from that visit can we apply to today's U.S.-China relationship? And I know that you would write a book on that. You probably have written a book on. You have written a book on this, but we'll try to keep this to 5 minutes.
Well, first, let me say that Madeleine and I, though in differing parties, have been close friends and have never looked at these policies as partisan policies. And one of the strong elements of U.S.-China relations is that a succession of American presidents and Chinese leaders have followed a fundamentally similar course. That is a great achievement. Now, in 1971, well, what made me go was, of course, that President Nixon asked me to go. But we had entered office with the attitude that we would want to improve relations with China, specifically that we would try to bring China into the international system, because to think of an international order without China was a contradiction of history. But each country had its own set of problems. We had the Vietnam War, China had the Cultural Revolution, so it took a while to establish contact. It took about 3 years to establish contact in very complicated ways. And one of the major decisions that were made was that there were constant clashes between the Chinese and the Soviets at the Chinese-Russian border. And we looked at a map and we came to the conclusion that Russia probably was the attacker in most of these circumstances. And so we had the problem of deciding if these two countries get into conflict, where should the United States be? And very early, even before we had been in China, we decided that it was not in the American interest for China to be defeated in such a conflict. And so out of this grew a series of moves which culminated in 1971 in my visit to China. And in my first meeting with Prime Minister Zhou Enlai, I was reading a statement to him, and I said, so now here we are in this, to us, mysterious country. And Zhou Enlai put up his hand and said, may I interrupt you for a moment? What is so mysterious about China? And I said something, I forget what it was. And he said, think about it. There are 800 million of us, and we are not mysterious to each other. So maybe, and the lesson was that we ought to learn of each other's thinking and motivations. And I think this was an advice that it was important to take and which is still valid today.
that more understanding their motivations and their understanding ours. Fair enough.
I think the Chinese culture background is different from ours. And therefore, the way it is important to understand the way China looks at problems.
Secretary Albright, similar question. Obviously, you were Secretary of State just as China was joining the WTO. Talk about the relationship at that time and kind of what lessons you learned from that experience that are applicable today.
Well, I also, let me just say, I was in the Carter administration working for Dr. Brzezinski and the National Security Council. So I was there for the normalization and watched what had, in fact, been a very organized way to follow up on what Dr. Kissinger had done and proceed with normalizing the relationship. And I was sitting outside the Situation Room and constantly seeing different people going in, and then all of a sudden this wonderful moment came with the normalization and Deng Xiaoping, coming to the United States. I think that what was very important was we were determined to kind of pursue this story of bringing China into the system. I think that was a very important part. When I was at the United Nations, I sat there with my Chinese counterpart, Li Xiaojing. Part of the issue was that we could never get the Chinese to participate in discussions unless it had something to do with interference in internal affairs. So you see the same people all the time. We got to be very good friends. So I finally gave him a little blue ball so he could practice getting strong and putting his hand up in order to be part of the discussions. Then I established a very good relationship with Foreign Minister Chen Chi-chen in terms of talking about more than just our talking points always, wanted to have a strategic discussion. So I do think that one of the issues that was so important was how to bring China into a normal trading relationship. The Clinton administration had worked very hard on that by having permanent PNTR, really, because whenever we were doing the renewal of the MFN was basically pulling up the plant to see if it was growing. And a great source of irritation. So the first step was to do the PNTR and bring them into a normal system, and then bringing them into the WTO was part of really this idea of putting them into the international system. One, we thought it was fair, and two, frankly, it made it possible for some of the rules of trade to be enforced internationally, not just in a bilateral way. So I think it's all part of the same story of trying to make sure that China was respected and was a part of a functioning international system. And that, I think, certainly was the view that President Carter had, President Clinton had, President Obama has had, and I think it's something that we have to consider, that they are the number 2 economy and they need to be part of a functioning international system.
Did it work? Did China's accession to the WTO work for America?
I think mostly, though there are questions, I think. Partially, the thing that I always found so interesting about China, by the way, any of us that have all dealt together, we know any diplomat has a set of phrases that we have. The Chinese do. It's a consistent and principled position. Everything was a consistent and principled position. But the bottom line is that I think that there were times that there were issues. They also want to be seen as the world's largest developing country. It's a little hard to be the number 2 economy in the world and still talk about being the largest developing country. So those have been a little bit of the arguments. And then there have been specific cases, obviously.
Dr. Kissinger, do you think accession to the WTO by China worked for America?
Yes, I do. I think the fundamental issue has been to see whether China and the United States could pursue parallel objectives. It was never going to happen that we would have identical views on all issues. The problem has been whether we could, as I said, achieve parallel objectives. Now, are there situations in which the Chinese had got the better of some negotiation? Undoubtedly. And it may even equally be true the other way. But having China as part of the international economic system, it's better than having a trade war between the United States and China. Within that general proposition, I would hope that improvements can be found, and improvement should be found, and maybe even systemic discussions could be held. But the fundamental objective, which was to treat China as a member of the international system, was very crucial. When we first opened to China, Chairman Mao did not really want economic relations with any foreign country. In 1976, the trade between China and the United States was less than the trade between the United States and Honduras. So one has to see this within the context of a rapidly expanding, almost exploding economic relationship. And there's room for improvement, but it was a good thing that these decisions were made.
I will come back to that in a moment, but I think because we're sitting at one world trade, you know, we're the epicenter of the 9/11 tragedy. And I think we're actually today kind of celebrating the rebirth of this area. I mean, that we can come here and hold this event is really, I think, is terrific. What's the role of fighting terrorism in the U.S. China relationship? What is it and what should it be?
Well, I think we clearly are threatened by terrorism in a number of different ways, and we have similar issues in terms of that there are those who feel that there's something about what we're doing that is wrong. What I think the role is, frankly, to share information. The question is that we have more and more today, what is information and how is it gathered? But I do think that there are ways we can cooperate. And while we don't think of piracy so much as terrorism, there has been cooperation on that. The Chinese have been very helpful on that. They also have been very helpful in terms, for me, the issue of terrorism is not how you deal with the end, but how do you prevent it in the first place? And I think that those are the issues that we can work on together, trying to figure out what the roots of it are. And then also, you may think this is kind of pushing it, but I think the fact that the Chinese are now participants in UN peacekeeping operations also helps in terms of looking at areas because I think on the issue of stability generally. So I do think that there is help, while the only problem, frankly, is that we might define certain groups that we think are terrorists, they don't think so, and people that they think are terrorists, we don't think so. But they are not the only country that we have some disagreements with on that. But I do think ultimately whatever the right word is, the civilized countries of the world have to figure out how to share information and try to rid ourselves of it.
Dr. Kissinger.
Well, there are various levels of terrorism. There are terrorist attacks within countries, and there are terrorist attacks that are based on an attack on the whole international system. Now, the underlying tendency of terrorism has been to destroy the state system and to create a universal caliphate to which all believers would then be subjected. That has been the manifestation that we have been most exposed to. Now, the Chinese do not have the same sort of issues that we have had in some of the countries, although there are parts of China where that issue has been very important. So we in China have at least two common objectives. One, to prevent the spread of terrorism around the world within various countries. And secondly, to try to create an international system which makes it more and more difficult for terrorists. Particularly, do we have a common interest in preventing terrorists from acquiring geographic territory so that they can link their activities with acting like sovereign states. This is where the ISIS problem is very important, and why evolution of some parts of Afghanistan can be of grave consequence for China. Madeleine mentioned the issue of pirates. So in terms of the general objectives, we in China have parallel objectives. How to apply them in specific circumstances, that's a subject that has to be explored and discussed. And I think there has been considerable progress made in recent years in those discussions.
Is there any evidence, and would it make any sense for China to work with North Korea and Iran to support ISIS? Do we have any evidence that that's the case? Have you ever heard of anything like this?
What?
That China working with North Korea and Iran to support ISIS?
Inconceivable to me.
That's what I thought also.
And I don't believe that. I've
Iran
never seen
doesn't
the
support
slightest
ISIS.
evidence of this.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Iran actually does not support ISIS.
Yeah, it's
Do you?
in the world
Yeah.
of fake news.
Yeah.
This is being talked about. The elephant in the room, Secretary Kissinger. What did President Xi say to you on Friday? What message did you convey to him, and what message did he convey to us? And it's a secret. Only those of us in the room and those watching on TV will know.
Well, I had all of this written down in a complete memo, and I was going to read from it, but the security people took it from me when I came in. Okay, I obviously, my general view has been frequently published. The United States and China are the two countries whose tensions could spread around the whole world, whose conflicts would make many solutions very difficult, and whose cooperation is needed for peace. So it is important for the United States and China to be transparent with each other about their objectives and about their general strategy in the world. We are both major countries, and we are both to step on each other's toes because of the magnitude of our efforts. But we must not permit a situation to arise like the one that led to the First World War, in which an accumulation of irritations finally led to a crisis that was no different from many crises that had been solved, and one day they couldn't manage it. So the United States and China have to try to design a way by which they can cooperate and by which they can work for common objectives. Fundamentally, there has been significant progress made in every administration. And whenever a new administration comes in, there is the concern that maybe it will take a different course. If Madeleine forgives me, in the early Clinton administration, President Clinton tried to deviate from the established pattern, but within 2 years he realized that the established pattern was based on our common interests, and he became one of the strongest supporters of this way of looking at international relations. So that's the spirit in which I have talked to every Chinese president. I'm sure that Madeleine has followed similar approaches. Then there are always specific issues that require special attention. But I believe this is needed now at the beginning of a new administration, and I'm hopeful that it will develop.
Well, let me just say, I have told Chinese friends not to pay attention to things that candidates say about them. Governor Clinton had said the butchers of Beijing, but once he was president-elect, I think he took a different approach or didn't speak about it very much. I do think that the Chinese have probably gotten used to some of the things that our elected officials have said, but I am concerned about what has just happened because it, in some ways, raises questions about all the things that Henry did in terms of the Shanghai Communique and the One China policy. And so while, in fact, what President Clinton was saying was that people had been arrested or mowed down by tanks, which did not deal with our values. And I think that Americans always have to state, and I always did whenever I met with the Chinese, was to explain our human rights policies and issues to do with Tibet, which is a little different than kind of questioning or seeming. I mean, I have no idea what happened. I only know what I read. But basically questioning the issue of what our relationship with Taiwan is. And the question is, as part of President Carter's normalization, we did have the Taiwan Relations Act. That was part of the agreement. But the question is, what was the intent of the phone call?
Dr. Kissinger, did President-elect Trump ask you to go to China?
No, I was.
Did he ask you to deliver a message to the Chinese?
Well, not in this sense. I was, of course, aware of some of his thinking, and he knew that I was going, but I was not going as a presidential emissary. I was going on a trip that I had planned many months earlier.
Were you surprised that he accepted a call from Tsai Ing-wen? Do you think that is in the interests of sound and productive U.S. China relations?
I was one of the drafters of the Shanghai Communique. And so there are clear premises of that communique. And and clear obligations. And I will not separate my views from the Shanghai communique and from the established procedure. I think also that at this moment I've been very impressed by the calm reaction of the Chinese leadership, which suggests that a determination to see whether a calm dialogue can be developed. But there's no question that the policy of opening to China has been based on the premise of a one-China policy.
Does this accepting a call when he's not yet president? I would argue that what our prohibition is about official contact. And since he is president-elect and not yet president, that actually is not an official contact. No?
Well, that is a good way to describe the subject.
Since I look to avoid confrontation, that's the way I describe it. You know, I do recall running into I believe it was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in Taipei, and I know because I worked in the State Department, I know the prohibitions, and I say, wait a minute, you're not supposed to be here. And he said, I've been named, but I haven't taken office yet, so I'm not official. So it was, you know, there is precedent for that kind of contact. But what do you think after that turmoil? The president-elect sent out a tweet after he was criticized, and I had to write it down to have it precise. Did China ask us if it was okay to devalue their currency, making it hard for our companies to compete, heavily tax our products going into their country, the U.S. doesn't tax them, or to build massive military complex in the middle of the South China Sea? I don't think so, exclamation point, close quote. What does that mean for the U.S. China relationship?
I think it's Madeleine's turn.
You didn't expect to get easy questions from me.
Look, it's perfectly obvious what my views are on these subjects. I think it's also not desirable that at the beginning of a new administration that it's finding its way, that I go into every one of these issues. I believe in a one-China policy. I believe it has to be preserved. I believe that our dialogue should be calm and focused on long-term objectives. But I don't think at this point it is important for me to second-guess every move that may have been made.
Well, let me say, I do think it's a statement of fact that the most important relationship we have is with China. And we all, diplomatically speaking, when it's complicated, you say it's multifaceted. So it's definitely multifaceted. I think that what we have seen is through a variety of administrations, beginning with President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, we have developed a way of talking to each other. And it is very well kind of patterned, and there are certain ways. It takes diplomacy. Diplomacy is, by virtue of the way you talk about it, you always have to put yourself into the other person's shoes. It is not negotiating for a hotel. And I think that the point is how to develop the right parlance here. And I know that it takes a while to kind of sort it out. But in the meantime, what I have found, and I have traveled abroad a lot since the election, is trying to explain to anybody, Chinese, or I was born in Czechoslovakia, so I went to Prague right away. Just say calm, and I agree with Henry, they are learning. But the bottom line is, tweeting has not actually been a foreign policy tool before.
But it didn't used to be an election tool
No.
either.
Well, but I do think that one of the big questions is how technology is used these days. But I do think also that the number of issues that we have with the Chinese, whether they are through the strategic and economic talks or military-to-military talks, really depend on relationships and having all the information. And I think, let me just say, the transition period is both too short and too long. I have been transitioned into, and I have done the transitioning. The latter is more fun. But the bottom line is it's a very complicated period where people in this country are talking to each other and somehow forget that foreigners are listening to them or hear what they're saying. And I really hope that my good friend Henry Kissinger has a very strong influence on President-elect Trump.
That is shared. Let's go from one.
Me, but
Let's
Ruin you. You're the only hope.
Let's go from one sensitive issue to another sensitive issue. The Secretary Albright, you were one of the, in fact, I guess to my knowledge, the only senior American to visit North Korea. You met with then Kim Il-sung, father of Kim Jong-un. You almost arranged for President Clinton to visit North Korea at after the election, prior to the inauguration. President-elect Trump is also talking about having discussions directly with Kim Jong-un. What lessons from your visit to Korea, you're dealing with them really probably more than any American official in decades, tell you about his idea?
Well, let me just say, it was interesting because we had had a lot of talks with the North Koreans throughout the Clinton administration. There were a lot of breakdowns of them, a lot of issues that came up at the United Nations. We'd had the agreed framework with them, a number of different ways. And then President Clinton had asked us to do because things weren't moving in any way, to do a complete review of Korean policy. And he asked former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry to do a review. And then we had some meetings with the North Koreans and explained this is fork in the road time. You either we're going to negotiate on some of the issues of missile limits, or we are actually going to take some action here, and they chose the negotiation. What happened was that Vice Marshal Cho, the number 2 man in North Korea, came to the United States and invited President Clinton to go to North Korea. And President Clinton, we were in the Oval Office, said, well, I might come at some point, but first Secretary Albright has to go. The truth is, we knew very little about Kim Jong-il. I had to talk to Kim Dae-jung to see, because he and the Sunshine Policy, he'd spent some time with him. Our intelligence said that Kim Jong-il was crazy and a pervert. He was not crazy. And when I got there, they put me in a guest house. And because we didn't have any embassy there, we had no idea what was going to happen. I first got instructions that I had to go see his embalmed father, Kim Il-sung. And it's very hard, actually, when you are trying to pay respect to somebody, not to bow too low, because that's too respectful and the press will be furious, and not to kind of pay no respect. So once I had agreed to do that, I went back to the guest house, and all of a sudden I get a message that the dear leader would see me. And so we had a meeting, a press conference, and it was something out of the 50s, really. And I'm standing there next to him, and I see that we're the same height. And I knew that I had on high heels, and then I looked over, and so did he. And his hair was a lot poofier than mine. But let me say this. We had pretty amazing talks in terms of arranging for missile limits. Kim Jong-il said we could keep our forces in South Korea, and there were a number of different agreements made. And again, it was one of those strange periods. I hold no brief for the North Koreans, but the bottom line is many Americans were confused about the election of 2000. He certainly was. And then when I came back, I briefed Colin Powell about what we had done. He was very interested in what we had done. Then the Washington Post had a headline, "Powell to continue Clinton policies." He was hauled into the Oval Office and told no way. So I do think here the North Koreans had reason to be confused. By the way, Dennis Rodman and all the basketball stuff is my fault, because there was one other thing we knew about Kim Jong-il. He liked basketball and Michael Jordan, and I brought him an autographed basketball, which they put in their Holy of Holies. But the bottom line is, I do think that we need to either get some version of the six-party talks. We need to talk to them. I do think that is a very important part, and decide that having a nuclear North Korea is dangerous for the Chinese. We have to do it with the Chinese. They need to understand that they don't want a nuclear-armed North Korea either. And so I think that within some kind of a multilateral context, it's important for us to talk.
But what President-elect Trump seems to be suggesting is a one-on-one with Kim Jong-un.
Well, if it should come to that, it has to be really, really well prepared. And the bottom line is we don't know enough about Kim Jong-un, and the question is who does the one-on-one and how they understand each other. But at some point, we have to talk to them. The situation with Iran is quite, similar but different. There certainly were a lot of talks that took place.
Do we know if in President Obama's conversation with President-elect Trump that there's been reference to a real threat, and that threat was North Korea?
Well, we were told that.
So
that was something
that is the case.
that
Secretary Kissinger, what would you, if President-elect Trump asks you, should he meet directly with President Kim?
Let me explain my general view of the situation. Korea has played a major role in Sino-American relations. It got us into a war in 1950 that neither side really wanted, because when the North Koreans attacked South Korea, they thought it would be an easy victory. And then when the United States came to the assistance of South Korea and moved north, China felt itself compelled, for its own historic reasons, to intervene. So you cannot separate North Korea from Sino-American relations in general. Secondly, the basic objective for the immediate future has to be to remove nuclear weapons from North Korea. There is no maneuvering that can make nuclear weapons in North Korea tolerable, because China will feel threatened, Japan will, every country in the region will feel threatened, and they're working on weapons that can reach the United States, and they have shown a total disregard for any proliferation. Now, of course, you could say if North Korea is prepared to give up nuclear weapons and wants to exist as a separate state, it is not for the United States to question its existence beyond the point where they threaten us. But the likelihood is, in my opinion, that if North Korea gives up its nuclear weapons, it will be, the regime will disintegrate. It's the only thing that they have achieved in their history as a national effort that is a demonstrable success. So therefore, it raises the question of what happens if North Korea disintegrates, which incidentally is a question in any event, because a regime so strange can maintain itself by brute force for some time, but sooner or later something may happen there that raises the issue of its survival. And in my opinion, if that issue of survival arises into an unprepared international community in which there have not been discussions of what to do in such a contingency, it has the possibility of a very dangerous escalation. So I think it is important for the United States and China to come to some understanding, not just about removing the nuclear weapons, but about the evolution of Korea after that. And that, in turn, will involve other countries in a continuing and subsequent negotiation. So in this sense, Korea is a threat in the military sense, but it is also a threat in the long-term sense. Many invasions of China have come through Korea. China will never be indifferent to the evolution of Korea, but nor will Japan be. And of course, South Korea has a huge interest. So it is very important to call attention to the need of building Korea into an international framework. Now, who should negotiate with whom and at what stage? I think it is too premature in this administration to discuss this in a realistic fashion. And one has to distinguish between general statements and short-term policy statements. And it is not likely that that there can be one dramatic movement, that negotiation that takes care of this. But first, the administration has to be organized, and its senior people have to be given a chance to consider that, rather than to go into every tactical statement that may be made.
I do think that people need to be aware of how these kinds of talks happen in the first place. Henry just mentioned all the stakeholders in this that have some interest in it. What does happen is there are multilateral meetings where various people sit, six-party talks at a table, but then there are breakouts from it where people can have pull-asides and have some beginning of some bilateral discussion. I don't think you begin, I fully agree with now saying, first let's get the leaders together, because it has to come in this context of what the region is like. The thing that has happened is the United States has two allies, South Korea and Japan, that don't exactly love each other, and we have responsibilities there. The region keeps shifting. Some of the things that have happened in the Philippines recently, a number of different things. It's going to require a way of us having these discussions with the Chinese within that larger context. And I personally think that there need to be some kind of multilateral talks that then, as happened when we were in office, that then evolve into something, not just flat out get them together, because the preparation for this is going to be huge. But I do think it is one of the biggest threats out there for exactly the reasons that you've got somebody, we don't know who he is, and he does have scientists and people that know how to develop this stuff.
You made reference to the changing kind of geopolitical landscape, especially the Philippines. Let's talk a bit about the South China Seas, which has certainly been an irritant in the U.S. China relationship, and President-elect Trump referred to it in his tweet. Chinese building these huge military establishments in the middle of the ocean. How do we fix it? What do you suggest to the president-elect that we do, and what do you suggest to President Xi that he does?
Well, I think we have an interest in having freedom of navigation. And by the way, I get so tired when people say, what are we doing in the Pacific? The United States, well, I always say we're not monogamous. We're both an Atlantic and a Pacific power. And we belong in the Pacific, and we have very great interests there, and navigation and trade routes are very important. I think that we have not gotten involved in the question of sovereignty, but I do think that we are concerned about the navigational aspects and the right to fly, and those things have to be worked out. The Chinese can't unilaterally decide. And the Philippines, it's, again, leadership does make a difference. What had happened was that the International Court had ruled on this, and then the new president of the Philippines has somehow changed his mind. But the bottom line is there is a way to do that. The problem is that the United States is not a signatory of the Law of the Sea Treaty, which puts us in a somewhat weaker position arguing for some of the rules that the international system has put down. But we depend on freedom of navigation, and we have to insist on it.
I think we're a signatory, but we
have not
didn't ratify
it. We have not ratified it.
We didn't ratify it.
Yeah.
Secretary Kissinger, any suggestions on the South China Sea? I mean, the Chinese would say, we believe in freedom of navigation. In fact, the greatest loser if freedom of navigation in the South China Seas was impeded would be China, because more of their trade goes through there than ours.
One has to, this is an example of the different way culturally the two countries look at it. The idea of the dotted line and of the Chinese claim up to the dotted line, this was made by some emperor 300 years ago. And when the idea of freedom of navigation and so forth was not developed, it has been maintained by every Chinese government. Chiang Kai-shek had the same view, and in fact, the current authorities in Taiwan have the same view about the significance of this. On the other hand, the United States' position on freedom of the seas has been developed over a long period of time. And so if one tries to settle this in absolute terms, it will probably be a very protracted and difficult issue. On the other hand, we have experience in the Shanghai Communique and in the evolution of the various agreements that were made between the United States and China following the Shanghai Communique by administrations of both parties. How the two sides can find a way of living with disagreements on the nature of the issue and postponing the final solution in a way that is tolerable to both sides. And I think that is the approach that should be sought now.
Interesting. The economic architecture, the economic architecture of the Pacific was, the Obama administration was sought to recraft it through the negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that died as a result of the Congress and will not wanting to pass it. And President-elect Trump has said on day one he will withdraw American signature from it. What is the economic architecture of the region going to look like, and what should it, from an American perspective, be crafted to look like? In other words, all right, we've decided, countries decided TPP is not what we want. Well, what should we be suggesting to President-elect Trump?
I think there's a whole question about the architecture, not just economic, but the architecture of the region. I am so old that when I was in college, we talked about SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. And there's always this kind of some attempt to have some kind of architecture. I think from a perspective of national security, TPP was offering that in many ways, of 12 countries coming together. Part of the problem, though, it didn't deal with the economic situation of the workers. And so I can see what the problem is. I do think the United States made a mistake by not being for the for the bank that the Chinese were setting up. I think that was a very important, and it would have made a difference if we had been enthusiastic about it instead of kind of standing aside. I do think that we need to see what, by the way, I think a point to add to what Henry was talking about culture, I've gone to China a lot, and more they are, with Xi Jinping talking about the fact that they have not been respected properly internationally, and kind of back to various grievances. And now with the One Belt, One Road idea, it's a very large, expansive program that they're interested in. And so the question is how they can go about their economic infrastructure without, in fact, having it be contradictory to what we might want to see in the region. Very interesting, the Chinese now are saying they have to get their labor is too expensive. They send their stuff to other countries. They are no longer, even though they say they are, the largest developing country. And so I think there needs to be a better way of trying to find a structure that may not be TPP, but is based on the concept. Because what's happening now, the Chinese are taking over what we have kind of left on the table. And I think that is going to cause issues for the new administration.
You think we'll see this regional comprehensive economic partnership that China
runs it
is creating, as it was kind of a TPP light would be my description of it. It doesn't really have the protections that TPP, or the investment protections. It's more a tariff agreement.
Well, we have a number of American leaders have said that America has vital interests in Asia, and that we are, in a way, an Asian power. So, and actually, President Xi has accepted that in a number of his statements. So, the strategic purpose of TPP, or of something like TPP, is to symbolize and formalize some kind of structural relationship between the United States and those Asian countries that want to have this relationship. And it cannot be in anybody's interest, either China or the United States, to see the world break up into regional groupings, in which the regional groupings then conduct themselves like national states towards each other, with much even greater consequences. So the basic concept of TPP was important, whether the specific conditions met everybody's concerns. I, as a non-economist, have never really looked at but as a concept, I think it was important.
Investment. The National Committee spends a lot of time looking at Chinese investment in the United States and U.S. investment in China. And even though trade is controversial, I think there is a consensus that investment is basically good, that it's job creating, that I think if President-elect Trump were sitting here, he'd say, yeah, investment creates jobs. And I think President Xi would say, yeah, foreign investment creates jobs. Do you think it is a reasonable theory to come up with that President-elect Trump will conclude what President Obama could not conclude, which is the bilateral investment treaty, that it will look to a business person as a low-hanging fruit and job creating, and that it would be a way to kind of lay a constructive foundation at the beginning of an administration, because in the Obama, they're this close to getting it done, but they couldn't get it done. Is that something you think that may be in the cards?
Well, not if that tweet you read is what he thinks, because there would have to be a certain amount of adjustments on tariffs and a number of different ways of looking at it. And the question is whether in a negotiation on a bilateral treaty,
Bilateral investment treaty.
A bilateral-
So
a
not
bid.
doesn't deal with
No,
tariffs,
a
just
bid.
opens sectors. So China will open more sectors to U.S. investment, and the U.S. will agree not to discriminate against China, but we don't anyhow. So the U.S. doesn't give up very much in this.
but I think there is a question how there is a kind of overlay of having said certain things about the way Chinese are treated. I happen to think it's a good idea for the Chinese to invest in the U.S. There are an awful lot of infrastructure things that need to be done and that don't run into the CFIUS problem and are worth doing. I think it's also worth Americans investing in China. The question is whether the atmosphere that has been created, whether if in fact one could go forward with a bid at this point. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Kissinger, anything on that?
I just don't think it's useful for me to go into what should be an immediate negotiation, particularly in the economic field, which where Secretary of Treasury Bill Simon, when we were both colleagues, said about me that my knowledge of economics was an argument against universal suffrage.
We've talked about, we were talking about the economic infrastructure. Let's talk about the security infrastructure, that there's been discussion of kind of reevaluating U.S. bases in Japan and in South Korea, restructuring how they're paid for. What kind of is that going to do to the kind of existing security architecture? Or does the architecture need to be changed because it's overly reliant on kind of Cold War thinking anyhow?
Well, let me just say, I teach at Georgetown, and I teach a course, I say, foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So the question is, what are the tools that we have? And so my course is called the National Security Toolbox. One of the tools is obviously the military tool, which is not just the fighting forces and the number of aircraft carriers, but in fact the bases and how they are used, who's on them, how they really enable us to have a presence in countries. I do think that some of the things that President-elect Trump has said generally about what our allies have to pay or not pay, whether it's NATO or in Asia, I think we do need to have a more cooperative approach to it, but we want those bases there, and we consider them important. And I do think that blackmailing allies into things is not a great idea. And that we know what our national interests are in Asia, and it's kind of a two-way street. They need us, we need them, but I think people need to think of bases as part of our toolbox to some extent. By the way, what I find interesting, there was a story in the papers today about the fact that Xi Jinping has now said that the Chinese need a smaller and more effective military. So they are also having questions in terms of how the money is spent generally, how do they use the tool, because we all have the same toolbox.
An alliance always has a particular assumption about the nature of security that's inherent in an alliance system. So it's inevitable that as time goes on, that there are periodic reconsiderations of what the proper balance is within an alliance, and also what the proper relationship is of the alliance to countries that are not part of the alliance. So I consider it natural that such discussions should take place, and one will have to evaluate it in terms of the nature of the assessments that are made. What should not happen is that one ally makes his role conditional on the other countries. That is something that it's a very last resort. But I tell you, we are here in a very complicated situation. When I agreed to this, we were going to discuss the basic relationship between China and the United States. My position on that is firm, fully explained in many articles, including a long interview in The Atlantic. It's now become a discussion of specific statements that are being made, and that's a much more, I just don't want to participate in that part of the discussion. I'm perfectly willing to repeat and strengthen. I believe that the United States and China must have a close and friendly relationship, that the peace of the world depends on the ability to do this, and that many principles have been established to achieve this. And it happens to be that this date was set at a moment when nobody knew the outcome.
Nobody predicted what was going to be going on.
And then we would have to discuss specific conditions. I would think normally Madeleine and I agree on the essence of these issues. Whether we agree on every tactical point, it's not so important.
Let me just say, we definitely do agree on the overall issue, and nobody has done more for U.S. China relationships than Henry Kissinger. And by the way, when Xi Jinping was still deputy premier, vice premier, he had come over. We had a meeting with all the former people, and he was explaining how he felt about the United States and that he'd spent time here and wanted to know what we had learned over the 35 years and what our relationship was. So then, as we're leaving, I said to one of the others, being in a meeting with Henry Kissinger's with the Chinese is like being with a demigod. and that other person said, leave out the demi. But I do agree. I do think the problem that we have, and I don't blame Henry for not wanting to comment on this, I am, however, free, is that the things that have been said can't totally be erased, which is something that I said initially, is that we forget how much foreign countries listen to what we are saying. And when it looks as though there's going to be, and I underline the looks as though, because we don't know, that there are going to be some quite different approaches to things. When he talked about a nuclearized Japan or various other aspects, I think we have to understand what the effect of it is, whether you can just blot it out from the consciousness of the people that we're dealing with. I do think that we have to be concerned about the importance of the U.S. Chinese relationship. I think it is absolutely essential. And there are so many aspects to it, so I hope very much that there is a learning process here. But how you erase what's been said, I think, if I were going on the other side into a discussion, I might say, what exactly did you mean by that? So I think that it's hard not to consider it. But I accept
No,
definitely
I understand.
what
I
Henry
understand.
said. Yeah. I haven't been asked to go to the Trump Tower.
One of the bright shining moments in U.S. China relations was the agreement between President Obama and President Xi on climate change. That really was kind of the view of many in the community, was that this was an example of America and China jointly leading the world, and that the myriad of kind of global issues, if the United States and China could cooperate on them, we would have a chance of solving them. If we don't cooperate, then we're doomed to failure. And climate change was kind of, the Obama administration did a great job of getting that and ultimately signing the Paris Agreement. Secretary
Well, let me
Albright, what
just
should
say-
we do going forward?
Well, let me say how important, because during the Clinton administration, we tried to deal with this with the Kyoto Protocol, and one of the whole issues was that it was unfair that developed countries had created the whole environmental mess, and then the developing countries were going to suffer about it. And we talked to the Chinese a lot about leapfrogging with new technologies, and yet that continued to be an issue. I do think that what has been done on climate change is remarkable, and I think that the Paris Agreement is quite different in terms of the various requirements of it, but the Chinese, the fact that the President Xi Jinping and President Obama were able to do this, I think is remarkable. I think it would be most unfortunate if it were not followed up. There's an article going around today that Vice President Gore, who is Mr. Climate Change, has had a meeting with Ivanka because that is apparently the thing that she is interested in. I think that's great. And I do hope that there is progress on climate change and that those people who think the earth is flat and don't believe in climate change actually are not the ones that influence President-elect Trump, and that he really continues with it.
This doesn't relate to recent news. So after both of you served, the Strategic and Economic Dialogue was created as a mechanism to kind of strengthen U.S. China relations, to build at various different ministries and agencies in the United States, to have many cabinet members go and many ministers from China come. Is this, from your perspective, is this an effective mechanism? Should it be continued?
To have a dialogue on these issues is very important. The evolution of these institutions is that they usually begin with a group that is small enough to have a reasonable, to have an effective dialogue. and then it gradually expands, and then increasingly the outcome of it is influenced by the communique, and so they begin working on the communique before they even meet, so that there is, I would say, there's a critical size of membership that permits an effective dialogue. So for example, what is now the G8 started as because I was president, that was actually started as a G5, and there were only 3 people permitted on each side in the room. Now it is a very large group. It still is useful because it permits side dialogues, it permits focusing on issues. So what I think is needed is, one, to keep the basic idea of the dialogue going, and then periodically examine whether the size of it needs some trimming or whether it is kept as a symbolic with some subgroups, but the concept is useful and should be continued.
I think it should be continued for a number of reasons. One is that we know in our government and also in other governments, things are not just contained in one box. So the strategic and economic things go together, the military. The other part is we have a tendency always to talk about how the leaders of a country get along. The bottom line is that it's nice to have that personal relationship, but there has to be carried out by bureaucracies in both the countries and the institutions. And so this is a way for some of the other people within the institutional structure to get to know each other, and then smaller groups to do drafting or whatever. But it does provide, I think it's a useful mechanism. We do it with some other countries in terms of having big meetings, of getting various ministries together, and I do think the important part here is how lower level officials begin to work together under the leadership of the leaders. So I hope it continues.
We have an illustrious audience here, so let me open the floor to questions. So right here in the front. And please identify yourself and keep the questions short.
I have a question for Secretary Madeleine.
Identify yourself.
I'm a partner of a listed company in Shanghai. I currently conduct research at Columbia University. And Secretary Madeleine, you said don't pay attention to what the candidates said, but something happened after the election day. Such as the Twitter post, the phone call from Taiwan, and we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. To be honest, for the Chinese business people, what they concern the most are the things such as the RMB, the RMB, the export to America. So, in your view, how will the political issues influence on the economic relationship between China and America? Thank you.
Yeah. I do have to say, I think campaigns are one thing, but once the person has been elected, it does, as I said, it does make you question where this is going. I do think that it is important for President-elect Trump and his people to know the reaction that it has created. I think that what will be important are the other people that he chooses in the government and how they will look at it. I have to tell you that at this moment, it is unclear. It is, to me, unclear. But the most important thing, I think, now is for everybody to stay calm and not to, I believe that the relationship, as I've said now, and so has Dr. Kissinger, is the U.S.-Chinese relationship, whether it's economic, military, security, is the most important relationship. And therefore, to make decisions based on a lack of information is very dangerous. And so I would hope that Beijing is not overly insulted by what was said, or that people are thinking that this is the policy. We don't know what the policy is yet. So that is my suggestion.
Let's see. Right here? Sorry.
Some people say it might be Mr. Trump's intentional move to test China's bottom line. So China's calm reaction might be interpreted as weakness and lead to even more provocation and bullying. So my question is, how would you comment on that? Thank you.
Look, I have tried to explain to this group. I have now seen 10 American administrations, and I believe that one of the big challenges to America has been the division of our country on many of these foreign policy issues. So I do not think it is desirable that at the beginning of a newly elected administration, we now elaborate all the points that can be made about which we can be divided. I've just spent 3 days in China, and I believe that it is possible to have a creative relationship between our two countries. And really, you shouldn't look for tricky questions to make me say something that it is clear I don't have any intention of saying, and that is contrary to my view of the current necessities. And so I believe what I have said. There are Americans who have spent 40 years on this problem who have the same view, and we will make our views known. And I think it is important to permit an opportunity for this concept to be developed. If it doesn't develop, then we all have to make our decisions on where to stand. But as far as the U.S.-China relationship is concerned, I believe that there are positive prospects. I believe they should be pursued. I have hope that they will be pursued. And therefore, you, ladies and gentlemen here, as far as you take my view seriously, you should focus on that and not see what points we can find that give us concern. It's when this date was picked, it was its part, it wasn't considered to be in such a particular period. There are reasons for concern, there are reasons for hope, and one should concentrate on those. And that's my fundamental point, which cannot be massaged by other questions.
I've only called on Chinese. Let me call on a non-Chinese back over there, yeah.
Hi, my name is Daniel Burke, and I work with the American economist Lyndon LaRouche. My question is for Dr. Kissinger. Mr. LaRouche has proposed that he's very strong in agreeing with you that U.S. and China must cooperate. And he's emphatic that the U.S. and China could cooperate on the One Belt, One Road policy. That this would be a clear way to rebuild the United States' collapsing economy. Further, he said that we could work together on space science and on the development of thermonuclear fusion. And I wonder if you have any comments.
I have never thought of Lyndon LaRouche in this particular context. But let me just say, I do think that there are ways that we can cooperate. I think one of the issues out there now also is cyber and various problems that are there and various possibilities. And the question is how our two great countries can, in fact, cooperate in a way that requires a certain amount of trust. So I hope very much that there is some pursuit of cooperation in a number of different fields. But I don't think we can underestimate what some of the difficulties are in that kind of cooperation.
I think the one road, one belt concept is an important idea. And I think that China and the United States can and should find a way of talking about it. It's one of the issues in which cooperation probably is possible. And so, well, I think perhaps my most useful contribution is to stop.
Last question, Graham. Last question right here.
Thank you very much. I'm Graham Majorhart from American Express. Now we're celebrating 50 years of the National Committee, and I'm wondering, what do you think the top 3 or 5 things we should be looking to celebrate at the 70-year reunion?
70 years.
20 years from now.
20 years from now.
Okay.
That's a very good question. Well, first of all, that many of our students learn to speak Chinese, that we have more and more educational exchanges, that we understand each other's history and culture, and that our work internationally is actually not in competition, but in cooperation in terms of, to pick up on the One Belt, One Road, in terms of infrastructure which brings people together, ways of understanding how dependent we are on changes in the climate and each other, and that we do, in fact, drop the fact that we are enemies when we actually have to work together. So neither of us will be here, but I do think that we need to look forward to that kind of a relationship.
What was the precise question?
20 years from now, what could we celebrate in the U.S.-China relationship?
I think 20 years from now we will either celebrate a creative cooperation or a degree of tension which will be spread all over the world by forcing every country to make a choice, which would lead to confrontation. So I think our obligation is to expect that the cooperative relationship about which both sides are talking, and both sides have proclaimed in administrations of both parties, will continue. And that is what I expect.
It's a perfect note to close on, but let me just, before we close, let me ask Secretary Albright about those. She's famous for her pins, as we all know. So what are these? These are monkey pins.
It's the year of the monkey, you know, and I've already bought my rooster for next year.
Well, I want to thank Secretary Kissinger and Secretary Albright for giving so generously of their time. Secretary Kissinger not only has given us this evening, but a week from Thursday will be honored by the National Committee with its Lifetime Achievement Award for the contribution to the U.S. China relationship over. But my advice to President-elect Trump would be very simple. Watch this video.
No.
Thanks.